Good afternoon, and welcome back to everybody. We're so pleased that you are here. I am happy to introduce the second half of today's workshop. I first wanted to make sure that we at Reset Dialogues express our thanks to one of our most important supporters over the years, which is of course the Nomis Foundation, and Heini Thyssen is here. And I wanted to express our recognition of your support. I want to introduce our chair of the next distinguished panel, who is the president of our advisory board at Reset Dialogues. And he is a professor of sociology at Georgetown University, but he is also someone who knows theology intimately, he knows history intimately, and we are very pleased that he is able to do this for us. And please take it away, José Casanova.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody. Especially thank you to our panelists. We have a distinguished group of prominent panelists, a political economist, a sociologist, a historian of intellectual and political thought, and a political scientist to discuss issues of inequality, caste, and democracy. And the central category here is caste, namely kind of a division of labor organized around the category of caste, very different than the category of class. So we are going to talk about which kind of stratifications are being shaped. On the one hand, we have still the enduring resistance of the old caste system, the Deep South, and the way in which racism has maintained the old caste structure. We have a new understandings that the new knowledge class, the new artificial intelligence economy is producing a new type of caste divisions, not only class divisions. And we also have recently new studies of how even Indian American communities are introducing or actually establishing the Indian caste system in the United States. So there are many issues. Obviously, the old category of caste is a very old Iberian category. The caste was Christians, Jews, and Muslims. This was the three caste society in medieval Iberia, a category that was taken by the Portuguese to India and has traveled obviously back and forth. But obviously, it's a stratification based on honor and status more than on money and the capitalist class structure. So without further ado, our keynote speaker is Professor Daron Acemoglu from MIT, a distinguished political economist. Among his most recent books are Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor. And his keynote is going to be on automation and the prospect of a new caste society. And afterwards, with comments and presentations by Michèle Lamont, a distinguished sociologist from Harvard, has worked for many years on issues of social stratification, the cultural dynamics of stigmatization, de-stigmatization, comparative sociologies comparing stigmas and how people respond to stigmas in the US, Israel, and Brazil. Then we'll have Sudipta Kaviraj, a professor of Indian political intellectual thought at Columbia University, a prominent member of the Subaltern Group Studies Collective, who of course has thought through many years the kind of stratification which is endemic in Indian society. And then finally, Rahsaan Maxwell, a political scientist, professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who has worked on immigration, ethnicity, all kinds of divides in Western European societies and how states produce and reproduce these divides. So without further ado, Professor Acemoglu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose. It's a true pleasure to be here, and building on what we heard from the previous panel. And I'm going to share my screen. As Jose said, I'm going to talk about automation and the prospect of a new caste society. And I'm not entirely sure whether the caste concept is the right one, but clearly we have a huge gap in status and capability inequality that has emerged over the last 30 years. And I'm going to argue that, not to underplay any of the topics highlighted in the previous panel, such as cultural conflict and polarization, but the technological and economic trends have been at the root of many of the fault lines and have exacerbated those cultural backlashes. And in particular, I'm going to emphasize the role of automation. But let's start with something that's tangible, which I want to draw your attention, and in my opinion does not receive enough attention, which is that really, if you look at overall labor demand in the US economy, and the picture is similar in many other advanced economies, there's really a sea change about what we experienced in the 4 decades after World War II and what we have experienced over the last 30 years, especially over the last 20 years. So here what I'm showing you is what economists call the wage bill of the private sector, which is total employment times average wages. And you see on the left, there's a remarkable picture. It's a very steady growth of about 2.5 percentage points faster in the private sector wage bill than population every year for about 40 years, which translated, of course, into more than 2% real wage growth for American workers. On the right, over the last 30 years, the same quantity first grows more slowly than before and then flattens out, and there's no change from around 1999 to today. So the private sector is not generating anything approaching the labor demand growth that we experienced in this economy. And that has various implications, not least the decline in the labor share in the economy. Capital captures much more, has much more greater power over labor, but also the huge increase in inequality that has happened more or less at the same time and is causally linked to this slowdown in labor demand. And that already starts telling you that there is something quite deep opening up, like a caste structure in the US economy. And just one way of seeing that, it's not the only way of seeing that, but looking at changes in real earnings by gender and education. And on the left, we have men, on the right, women, and then the different colors correspond to different education groups. And you see that in the 1960s and early 1970s, and the picture is similar in the 1950s, you have this picture of, a rising tide lifting all boats. That very rapid growth of labor demand translated into commensurate real wage growth for all demographic groups. Pretty remarkably, the postgraduates and the high school dropouts more or less experienced the same real wage growth. But then 2 remarkable things happen. First of all, both for men and women, sometimes starting in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there's this big fanning out. The gap between the top and the bottom is opening up. But also, perhaps as consequentially, you see that the real earnings of men, low and middle education men, is actually dropping sharply. So the red, for example, the high school dropouts, or the orange, high school graduates, even those with some college, the 2 years of college degrees, community or associate degrees. And you see the college graduates who don't have postgraduate degrees is pretty flat. It's really a labor market in which the postgraduates, those with very specialized skills, are benefiting. For women, it's a little bit better because women are catching up during this period still. But the increase in inequality is very similar both for men and women. There are huge social costs of inequality and the falling real incomes of low education men. And I think some of the cultural backlash and polarization is related to this, and we can come back to that in the discussion session. But it is also raising the risk of a new caste society, not just because inequality is increasing, but because the status of people who do not have those specialized skills has also fallen very sharply during this time period. Such a complex phenomenon has many roots. Globalization is part of it. The disappearance of institutions protecting low-wage workers is part of it. But even more important, both for the phenomenon that I showed you so far and its ramifications into a new caste society, is that actually the technological changes are largely underpinning these developments. And one way of thinking about that is that, in contrast to what many economists typically go back to, which is technology is always good and it will just generate gains that are going to be shared. We can think of different types of technologies having very different implications for labor demand and very different implications for different groups. So in particular, automation, those types of technologies that replace tasks previously performed by late workers, middle skilled workers, low skilled workers, manual workers, I think those are going to have very different effects. So in the work that I have done over the last decade or so, I have also looked at how this is changing over time. And this picture, again, I think is pretty remarkable in my opinion, because what it shows is that on the left, what you see is that during those 4 decades, where you had this very rapid growth of labor demand, you had a lot of displacement shown by this dashed line, workers leaving, losing out relative to capital, but it was broadly counterbalanced by what we call reinstatement, new technologies, new tasks that are creating new opportunities for humans. So much so that the sum of those two is this thick blue line in the middle. It's hovering around 0, that is showing that the two are broadly counterbalanced. Look at the last 30 years, and you see a completely different picture. Much faster growth of this displacement and much slower reinstatement. We are putting all of our eggs in a single basket, and the thick blue line is going south. Now, this might sound abstract, because here we are aggregating different types of technologies, and we're leaving out perhaps some other aspects of technological change. But we can just focus on the specific example of what I mean. Robots. Robots is a tip of the iceberg, because most automation takes algorithmic forms today in the service sector, for example. But robots are something we can measure, and we can look at it. And let's look at what happened in areas, local labor markets, where you have faster adoption of robots. And you see that despite the fact that robots are one of the most innovative manufacturing technologies of the last 3 decades, the gains have been extremely unshared. In places where robots have been introduced and productivity effects appear to be fairly positive when firms introduce robots, labor demand has fallen, wages have fallen. I'm not showing you the wages here, I'm just showing you the private employment. And this is led by the industrial heartland of the United States. So the places I have listed here, Detroit, Wilmington, Cleveland, Toledo, those are the heavy industry heartlands of the United States. And those are the places, of course, where you're seeing this cultural backlash as strong as in other places. Beaumont, Texas. This is, part of where a lot of those cultural tensions are being seen. These places are not driving the relationship. This cloud of points has exactly the same slope if you do a regression through it, but they are emblematic of what I'm trying to say, that automation, not counterbalanced by other opportunities, is creating these tensions, both in the labor market, but in the social sphere. Of course, you might say robots is the technology of the past. The future is AI, and AI is different than robots. And yes, that's right, because AI is a broad technological platform. It can be used in many, many different ways. It can be used for increasing human activity, empowering humans. But in practice, actually, I think the problem is worse with AI. It's worse because of 2 aspects. First of all, the evidence so far, including some work that I have done, suggests that AI adoption has so far been driven by the same business model of companies that is targeted on substituting algorithms for humans. But in fact, it's also worse because by virtue of its greater scope, AI is going to deepen the status inequality. It's going to deepen the new caste. Those who are going to have a voice politically, socially, through AI-mediated interactions, and those who are going to be discriminated against by machines and algorithms are going to be silenced, are going to be monitored and snooped over much more effectively because of AI. So AI is at the same time, even though it could go in a very different direction, is at the same time it's going in the same direction as robots, at least that's the early indication, but it's also going to change the democratic process that in the past, during similar episodes, was one of the most powerful ways of reversing trends, tendencies towards creating new inequalities. So the question that will be critical is who will control technology, who will control AI? Well, so far, the answer is that a handful of large companies are controlling technology, a handful of large companies are controlling AI. McKinsey Global Institute, for example, estimates that 2 out of 3, every $3 spent on AI is in the hands of, is coming from the big tech in the United States and a few Chinese companies. So it's a huge concentration of research in the hands of a small number of companies, and it's their visions that's shaping it. Global competition is another factor that's pushing companies towards focusing on automation. But we're also making things much worse with our tax system, and that's going to be relevant when I come back to articulating some policy ideas. If you look at the US, always been the case that labor is taxed more heavily than capital in the US. But over the last 20 years, if you look at labor taxes, they've been roughly constant around 25% because of income taxes and payroll taxes. But taxes on equipment and software, the types of capitals that are involved in automation, algorithmic or otherwise, have fallen sharply because of depreciation allowances, because of many S corporations evading taxes, and because of course, cuts in the marginal income tax rates of the capital owners. So instead of around 15 to 20%, now capital is taxed at less than 5%. Today, many companies actually receive a net subsidy when they automate work and get rid of workers and substitute machines in their place. Now, one argument that I find very unconvincing, even if it were true, but it's actually, I'm going to point out, is not true, is that, well, what can you do? This is the path of technology, and it's going to create a lot of benefits for us, and we have to put up with some of its negative influences, such as inequality and disempowerment for some workers. Well, the truth is actually very different. Not only are these consequences very costly, but they are unnecessary, and moreover, we are not getting much of a productivity gain from these technologies either. If you look at patent statistics, we have never generated so many new widgets as we are doing right now. Patent statistics are exploding. But if you look at what we are getting as an economy or as the sectors that are adopting the new technologies, we're not getting much. So if you look at the headline number that economists use, total factor productivity growth, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, that was as high as 3%, sometimes 2%. And today it hovers around 0.5%. So we're not seeing any of the fruits of this. And in fact, that's part of the reason why private sector labor demand is so anemic. We are hit by a double whammy. Productivity is not increasing, and we are using all of our creativity for automating work. And we're not getting any of the benefits that we sort of automatically got in the 50s and the 60s. The COVID crisis is creating many problems, but it will undoubtedly exacerbate the problems that I have articulated. Many more companies says they are going to, they are taking actions for further automation, more than 75% of them. And of course, many of the occupations where low-wage workers were are becoming more and more under pressure. The argument that I want to make is that the way to build a new society is to first recognize that the future does not need to be fully automated. We can use many of these technologies in many different ways, both in the workplace to increase human productivity, and also in the way that we use them for democratic governance, for communication, for privacy and protection of individuals against companies and governments, rather than increasing the power of companies and governments against them. But this can only be done if we have a new institutional framework to guide us. So this is not easy at the best of times, and it's made even more difficult because when you look at history, typically the creation of new institutions, especially the new institutions that protect those who are weak and less powerful, disenfranchised or disempowered, comes from combination of two things: bottom-up demands and government action that sort of introduces regulations to protect them. And all of these are actually not functioning together. We have the malfunctioning of democracy that I don't need to dwell on because I think everybody recognizes. There is widespread collapse of trust in institutions that makes it very difficult for them to be used for anything like this. And of course, the erosion of expertise and autonomy in institutions is another exacerbating factor. So essentially, what we are facing with is then a situation in which we need new responsibilities from the state. In fact, new responsibilities that we have really never tried before, because even at the heyday of the welfare state, you know, the welfare state was mostly concerned with macroeconomic management, social security, social safety net, labor relations. But today we need something much more than that. Regulation of technology, and in fact, I don't have time to get into it, but regulation of globalization and international coordination as well. So these are extremely onerous new responsibilities on the shoulders of the state. And that requires, A, the state to have the capacity, the expertise, and the trust to carry those responsibilities. But it also requires that we can keep the state in check once it's been so empowered. This was actually what worried this gentleman here, one of the most influential social scientists of the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek, who wrote the Road to Serfdom in response to Beveridge Report in 1942, which was a template for the UK version of the Welfare Point 1.0. And he was worried that you would never be able to keep a new state that was administratively so powerful from turning into a totalitarian state. But in the end, Hayek's concerns did not come to pass. And this is my last slide. And I want to sort of provide one perspective about why Hayek was wrong and what might be one little hope for us in trying to forge this sort of new institutional framework. And that comes from the ideas of my new book with James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor. This is what we call the Red Queen effect. And this figure, which is sort of the emblematic of the theory of the book, sort of gives the story of it, that we think of democratic institutions, new capabilities for society, new ways of conceiving and practicing liberty as evolving in this narrow corridor here, which is defined by a balance between the power of the state, its capacity, its repressive apparatus, and the power of society, its ability to withstand the demands of the state through collective action, through norms, traditions, as well as, of course, democratic voice and participation. And the key here is that while outside of this corridor, one dominates the other, inside the corridor, there's a balance where each have to run in order to keep up with each other. And that's the dynamic that in some sense, Hayek did not fully recognize. He recognized that there is a conflict between state and society, and that was his big sort of insight that really resonated with a lot of people, making The Road to Serfdom such an influential book throughout the second half of the 20th century. But what really happened in Scandinavia, for example, after the Workers' Party came to power in 1932 in Sweden or in 1935 in Norway, is that you actually had that, despite the fact that the state was becoming much, much more powerful, much, much more interventionist, democracy deepened. There was much greater participation in politics. And that's what we mean by the Red Queen effect. And that's exactly what happened in much of Western Europe and in some bastardized form in the United States as well. And the fact that it was bastardized, of course, is because of the inequities that existed in social status, social participation, especially in the US South, but also throughout the weakness of the federal government in the United States, something that we spend some time on in the book, but I will not get into it today. So this is one hopeful way of ending this talk, which is to say, well, perhaps there is a way of proving Hayek wrong again. It's not easy. It requires what we haven't been able to do so far, which is articulate new ways of thinking of how the state can play a useful role, find the right coalitions for it, but at the same time, increase the power of society so that the society keeps the new and much more interventionist and much more powerful state in check as we develop. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Acemoglu. Without further ado, Professor Lamont, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Daron, for this very stimulating talk. It's obviously the new book is, again, one that will be widely discussed. I think what I'll do in my comments is both try to connect your talk with the previous session, but also ask a few questions, putting on my hat as a sociologist. I'm extremely sympathetic with your Red Queen theory. And of course, I've been following the work of many economists who are pushing now for a much more interventionist role of the state. I'm a big fan, for instance, of Mariana Mazzucato's work, who Sherry Berman exposed me to. The big question for me is really, if we are going to have a more participatory society, where is it going to come from? And the model of the public sphere that many social scientists still operate with is very outdated. So much has changed since Habermas, and I think we're still very much in the process of thinking about how the new media ecosystem has changed, with, of course, the central role of social media, but also the NGOs that have become far more professionalized, and the social movements that have become far more supported by philanthropy than it was 40 years ago. So I'm in the process of writing a book which is on social change, and there's a huge enterprise to transform narratives, especially about, dislodging the neoliberal model of the self that has become extremely hegemonic. And the Ford Foundation and many other progressive foundations have been spending a lot of money supporting social movements, including Black Lives Matter, Color of Change, many movements that aim at getting more people of color in particular to vote. So I think the traditional model counted much more on the role of labor participation in keeping the state at bay, and we know what are the figures today. I think we really have to think about where are the new forces for increasing participation going to come from, and really think in terms of, path dependency tracing, how the various sectors that engage political participation, but also more generally social activism, advocacy, where are these forces coming from and who are supporting them? So I think here is a case where the various social sciences need to join arms to really think, flesh out your models so that the stronger involvement of the private sector is understood in sociological term, in terms of where is the energy coming from and how the public sphere has changed. Now, to broaden the conversation further and link it to the earlier discussion about dirty work and worthy models of worthiness that Apia was talking about, I think another thing we need to do, I think, is the introduction of this caste, this transformation in terms of caste that you have mentioned. We have to connect the cultural dimension to the technological and economic dimension that you've elaborated. And I think most people are not fully aware of the extent to which the hegemony of college-educated professionals and managers, our group, has really deeply consolidated itself over the last decades, where representations of working class people on the media is exceedingly rare. And when they're present, they are presented as idiots or buffoons. So it means that the working class is experiencing more and more stigmatization. And this really leads us to think much more systematically about how can we advocate a plurality of scripts of self and how can we foster it. We know that the current situation does not serve the upper middle class either. There's a massive mental health crisis among Gen Zs and millennials, and the adults are not doing very well either. So we need to rethink this model that was based on competition, economic accumulation, and self-reliance, because clearly, if you think from the 1980s until today, it's a massive disaster between the opioid epidemic and the mental health crisis that we are witnessing, us as academics, as we see our graduate students and our undergrads struggling. So we need to think about how can we populate the public sphere with a much more diverse understanding of what a worthy self is. And that means celebrating ordinary forms of universalism, where we learn to valorize human beings, not only because they're professionally successful, but also because they can serve a range of social purposes. And in the current book, I've been with my students, been interviewing a number of Gen Zs who are really resisting and rejecting the American dreams, in part because it's viewed as unreachable for them. And instead, they are embracing values such as inclusion, sustainability, authenticity. And I think that they are showing us the way. One could think about inclusion as being the new American dream for that generation. The kind of life that they want is one that allows everyone to be who they want to be, whether it's in terms of sexual orientation or celebration of indigeneity, in the Latinidad. There's a great many expressions of them, that of such orientation, that have really exploded this summer. And it's not random. There's a lot of foundations, there's a lot of forces behind this deep transformation of American society that we're now witnessing. So I think I'll stop here, and we'll continue the conversation, and I look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say.
Thank you, Michèle. Sudipta, why don't you take over, please?
So what I shall do is I'll talk mainly about what I thought regarding the events very recently, the elections, and the question of the divided society. But I shall try to approach it through the lens of Isabel Wilkerson's remarkable book, Caste. I'll make just 2 or 3 points very quickly. I feel that what the book does, and also what we saw recently, forces us to not merely think about the complexity of the problems. I think it, as has been reflected in many of the presentations, I think for political theory as well, this is a challenge to reconceptualize some of our concepts. I think we need to elaborate and make more refined the concept of personal identity and the concept of collective identity, because these two things are involved in this discussion. I'll make a couple of remarks about that as I go along. What I found most interesting about Wilkerson's book is that she is not engaged in what I would call a comparison between caste in India and caste in the United States. The discussion about Nazi Germany, I think, is of a slightly different sort. But I think what she does very cleverly is to get into a kind of convexity of conceptual use. What I mean by convexity is that she does not leave the concept of caste, class, race. She does not leave the concept of, she does not get into the concept of caste entirely exclusively. What she does is to use it in a convex way. That is, in a sense, to write the concept of caste over the concept of race. And I think that allows her to see certain things with much greater sharpness, which I greatly liked about the book. And I think, although the book is not a book of political theory, I think those of us who are interested in the logic of methodology and things like that, we should look at what it is trying to do by simply asking us to look at something which has been deadened by experience, something to which we have been desensitivized in a certain sense through its availability to us in history and in our present, by asking us to look at it through the angle of a different concept. I think it shows us a lot of things which we would normally ignore. But I wanted to make essentially 2 points about what is happening now, the divided society, the question of healing, taking both of them from, I think, Wilkerson's argument. What I find remarkable of Wilkerson's argument, thinking about the present moment, is that following her, we could say that we are looking at 2 divisions. One is a very long-term division, the division of slavery, which is not present, but if we follow German thinkers like Gadamer and others, some of these very deep things in the history of society, they live through effective history. The institution might go, but the long-term effects of the institution, they continue to be present. And to have a simplistic understanding that the institution is formally abolished and therefore its consequences are abolished is not the right way to look at it. So in that sense, for instance, when I look at India, I see my society as a post-colonial society, not because colonialism is finished, but much of the effects of colonialism remain unfinished. In fact, colonialism is a past, which is present in my present today. So it is in that sense I would see Indian society as post-colonial, rather than post-colonial in the sense of a complete rupture with the past of colonialism. What is interesting, if you look at it this way, I think she makes 2 points, which I think are both right, that through the abolition of slavery and then the civil rights movement. There is a kind of institutional and formal change, but the institutional formal change did not disrupt or did not destroy what you might call the cage of caste. That is the fixed status of some people in society in a particular economic and social position, which is also a status. I think she also plays with status in a very interesting way. That status is something which can be felt as very strong, very powerful, even when it is almost completely contentless. That is, it is not based on class, it is not based on anything else. But even then, people who feel status, they feel something which is very strong. And I think she sees, part of the white society in America to feel status that way. I think what comes out of that discussion seems to me that because of these changes, it has been possible for individuals to come through the cage in a certain sense, for individuals to come up, occasionally to flourish and thrive. But ultimately, the event which was most symbolic, symptomatic of this kind of change to show how far this change can go, but in two senses of the phrase, how far. How far in the sense meaning how long it can go, how high it can go, but also how far in the sense that how limited it can be. Is the rise of a black man to the White House, the entry of a black man to the White House, which I think is the end of a certain kind of structure of the world for some people. It's the end of the world. And people tend to respond to that in many different ways, which is, I think, reflected in the rise of Trump. And I think that allows me to see this kind of indignation as a continuum. And at one end of the continuum, you have the birtherism. At the other end of the continuum, you have the knee on the neck of George Floyd. So she also allows me to see this rage as something which is complex, extended, but it is also something which is a continuum. And if we assume that, then I think the interesting thing would be to say that simply because there is a formal change in the government, it might not be very easy to heal that division in society. So healing would not mean that you extend your hand to people who are feeling like that and then go back to the past. I don't think there is any way of going back to the past. And I'm not surprised that in all the different papers I have heard in this conference, coming from many different types of angles, there is a recognition of this. People have phrased it in many different ways. And so therefore, I think we must actually think of a way in which healing does not mean that we go back to the past in any sense like that, but we go into a dispensation which is more just in some sense, and to get people to get reconciled to this new sort of institutionalization of justice in American society. I wanted to make one last point very quickly. This is again an analytical point, but I think reading Wilkerson, although she does not comment about the present election, but I thought that she is making an argument which feeds into my way of understanding society, which helps me understand what happened in the past election and this election. Identity, we use the term identity in political theory rather casually and rather oversimplistically. But I think identity, we do not have multiple identities. Every one of us has a single identity, which has many attributes. So I'm a Bengali, I'm an Indian, I'm a professor, I'm whatever, leftist, rightist, I might be Hindu or Muslim or something. These are not my identities. These are all my identity attributes. And I also have something like a verb, something like a capacity in me to mobilize these attributes of my identity in various ways, responding to different circumstances. So in a particular circumstance, I might actually foreground my class identity and fade my ethnic identity. In some cases, I might actually do the opposite. And this is again, I don't think this is an entirely new argument, but I think this is an argument which is quite often lost sight of, that to understand the complexity of individual identity. Also to understand, I think we must understand the complexity of collective identity. Collective identity is not subjective in the sense in which an individual identity is. When I say that I feel like all other Hindus, all Hindus do not actually feel the same thing. So in a certain sense, my experience of being a Muslim or a Hindu, in a collective sense, is basically a representation of some way of being a Muslim or a Hindu that I see around in the world, which I represent to myself as as my way of understanding what is happening to my group. So the last point I wanted to make is that if you agree with me that that is how we should look at identity, that identity is composed at least of two things: attributes on the one side, like adjectives, and a function or a capacity on the one side to place emphasis or to reduce emphasis on one of these identities and put them together in a particular combination at a particular moment. I think what I found startling in the Wilkerson book, which helps me understand some of what is going on about the argument over the white working class, is that a distressing experience which has come to me through one characteristic, let's say decline of industry and my losing a job, which is a class experience, which is an economic experience. I might actually make sense of it to myself, not as a class experience, but essentially as a race experience or an ethnic experience. So I can experience it through one arc or one characteristic segment of my identity. But my political response to that might actually come through a different segment of my identity, which I think is quite possible. And so my response to this question of a divided society is that there are two intellectual problems. One is the intellectual problem of this kind, that we must have an apparatus of understanding both individual and collective identity, which is more complex than the ones that we have. But apart from that, of course, the much greater problem is the problem of fashioning a conception of a just society, which responds to the difficulties and the complexities of this situation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sudipta, for these complex reflections. And now, Rahsaan Maxwell, Professor Maxwell, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the panelists. We've raised some excellent points. And actually, I'm going to pick up on some of those from a slightly different angle. Thank you also to Reset for organizing this great event. So yeah, I mean, so this question of inequality and democracy was my way in, and there are lots of ways of thinking about inequality. Some of them have been raised, and in fact, one of the points that was just made is that we have multiple identities or multiple attributes of our identity. And in many ways, society right now, the question is, how do we, as you said, how do we combine or how do we aggregate these different interests, which is an old political problem. But if you look at American society, and the same is true elsewhere, we have these big economic divides, which of course have multiple dimensions, as mentioned in the keynote. We also have these racial divides, which have exploded this summer in the United States. We've been talking about geographic divides for a while, and then in recent years, we've been talking about them again. We've also been talking, we had the Me Too movement and different gender divides that have gained prominence again. We have the sexual divides, or however you want to frame them in terms of these different types. Their culture, as a broadly speaking, this notion of, are different types of culture not sufficiently represented in mainstream culture, mainstream outlets. Also the stuff that I've studied, national origin divides in all of our countries, that's especially strong in Europe. The religious divides that were talked about earlier in the previous session. We also have age, generation. This is something that has been coming up in recent years, and then the pandemic and all the overlapping pandemic divides are being exaggerated there as we talk about the boomers and what they've maybe done to the Zoomers or whoever else is there younger. So there are all these divides, and so political scientists, and of course everyone here, I'm sure not just political scientists, everyone here has heard of the term cross-cutting cleavages. When we look at societies that are supposed to respond in a healthy way to different divides if you have different parts of your different attributes of your identity that have different interests on different dimensions. Then you're probably going to have, you know, one interest in one way, but then another interest in another way, and so you might find some compromise. And so having it's a bad thing when all of those, someone has not heard of cross-cutting cleavages, but if all those divides, if people who have the same economic, same racial, same religious, same cultural, same geographic interests all line up in one side, then society is starkly divided between two parts. But if my racial identity leads me to think one thing, and then my geographic identity leads me to think something else, then maybe sometimes I align with my race, sometimes I align with my geography, sometimes I align with my class, so on and so forth. And so in many ways, if we look at the United States, there is a lot of evidence of cross-cutting cleavages. I mean, just the simple one of race that I like to, that I think about, you know, we have all these black people in the Republicans now, you know, we have what's his name? Kanye West coming out talking about all these young rappers, not to mention Ben Carson, wherever he came from. So you have all these different people that have multiple aspects of their identity that maybe is a potential, you know, whether or not I agree with them, it's a potential to find some compromise across these divisions. But the problem that I see, and I'm sure some of you will have thoughts or think the same thing, is that right now, at least in the United States, you know, we're suffering from a system overload, because even if individuals might have multiple points of compromise, the political and the media and the societal agenda can only handle one crisis at a time, and then that crisis has to get ratcheted up to extremely high levels. And so the certain inequalities capture our attention. And then, of course, we all know about the way the media system functions these days, with two talking heads, one from one far out extreme representing almost no one, another from the other far out extreme representing, again, almost no one. And then the dialogue gets ratcheted up, and it gets very hard to find compromise. I'd be curious, I'm assuming that a lot of people here are from the left, but, you know, lots of ways to think about this, but phrases like Black Lives Matter, which, you know, there's a lot of good reasons for that. Defund the police, these are old debates among Democrats, but when you have to explain your slogan and why it doesn't mean what you think it means, then you've already lost. I mean, that's the first rule in politics. Don't explain yourself ever, because then you're already losing. And so these things have, you know, of course, there's a good reason to stake out strong claims and to push for them. And, you know, and I'm not coming here to argue against either of those movements, but the rhetoric has gotten very difficult to achieve these compromises. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges of how can we, again, which is building on what was just said, you know, how can we find these points of connection? And unfortunately, a lot of the political science research shows that the American political system is currently not very well suited to representing the complexity of the public. There are these huge biases and these huge skews in terms of who actually gets represented, relating to gerrymandering and, of course, all kinds of issues that I'm sure we all know about. So my point on this notion of inequality and democracy is that there are multiple kinds of inequality, unfortunately, and in theory, that could be fertile ground for finding compromise across those intersections. But unfortunately, I'm not optimistic about how the US can do it in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rahsaan, Sudipta, and Michèle for the excellent comments. And I just want to build on something that Michèle said, which I think is very important. And I meant to say it, but I was rushing. So I think the issue that, you know, where the public sphere that's going to bolster or support new types of political engagements will come from, I think that's central. And that's why I actually think that automation and AI are so dangerous, even though they also offer opportunities, because they, you know, automation sort of creates itself a new sort of division between those with the expertise and the education. And then they also decide where automation goes and where the discussion is and what the problems are and whether AI is a promise or a threat, or in what ways it is a threat or a promise. So that's the reason why I think, you know, I really worry when, you know, Davos takes on the mantle of dealing with inequalities, because Davos is an epitomization of a very small group of people with the expertise in some narrow domain that have declare themselves to speak for everybody. And that actually, rather than solving the problem, actually exacerbates the problem. So therefore, I actually see the solution in dismantling these edifices that we have actually built over the last 3 or 4 decades, and creating a bigger room for people to participate in the political discussion. You know, when is it that last time we saw workers or civil society or disadvantaged groups or immigrants at the table when we are deciding what to do with AI technologies, or what to do with what technologies, or how to choose different political institutions? So I think that's actually what we need to start doing. And I think once we do that, it's actually amazingly transformational. I believe it would be amazingly transformational. I actually think it's very hard to do that. There's no way that we can sort of leave the grip of Davos. And again, using Davos as a symbol, not as the real sort of problem, but to get out of that is really hard, because that's part of that self-reinforcing cycle, and that's really where your real concerns are, to me, so important. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else would like to add something?
There is a question. Will someone please elaborate on objective conditions such as those exposed by Weber, status power, or subjective notions like identity, whether individual or communal, and the implication for political change? One question. Second question is about China, about the Red Queen effect explained by Daron. The Red Queen effect, the race of the Red Queen, the society and state. Any thoughts about Xi and China measure up in your analysis? The question is addressed to Daron, Acemoglu, and portended future prospects to offset Hayek prognosis?
I'll just follow up what Giancarlo said, adding 2 questions from the Q&A, because one is actually related to this last question relating to China, which says that if we intend to regulate AI development, and will countries like China be at the table when there's so much at stake, will they be willing to join the conversation? And the other question is, and it's a general question, does a 2-party political system enhance or obstruct the agility of a nation in the context of social change?
I think others are much better qualified to answer the Weber question. Michèle, I'm looking at you, but let me say something brief on the 2 questions on AI and China. So yeah, I mean, the framework I presented is simplistic, but within that framework, you know, China actually is an ideal type. It really fits very well, and it's not one where you have the Red Queen effect, because there is too much of a power imbalance. That doesn't mean that everything is static, but you know, precisely this framework was partly as a critique of the modernization hypothesis, or the sort of the end of history view that all societies, as they become more prosperous or more educated, are going to follow a single path. China shows a different path. It's not a static path, but in that path, as you know, political awakenings in small scale happen, the state with its enormous apparatus is much better equipped to suppress them. And you know, Xi actually, his vision is one of exactly silencing even the little bit of civil society movement that had started with the independent human rights lawyers, or you know, on social media in China. And so that sort of shows why that system is going to be very durable. It's not going to self-negate itself anytime soon. And AI actually empowers it. AI creates an imbalance between state and society, because the state is much better able to control AI and use it for its, you know, monitoring and suppression tactics. So there is no doubt that China is going to be at the table when AI is discussed, but the question is whether the vision of AI that comes from China will be helpful. And I don't think it will be helpful, but neither will the one that's coming from the US, by the way. So I think among the polar powers that have, the only one that has sort of a vision of AI that's useful is actually European Union because of its greater emphasis on regulation and privacy. But actually the other group that needs to be at the table, in the same way that, my response to Michèle, developing countries. Developing countries are going to be very, very heavily affected by AI. The displacement of workers from jobs that were created through offshoring and exports, that's going to be very much up for AI. The effects of AI on democracy, as you can see in Brazil, that was first order event. But developing countries are not at the table. So how do you actually bring the international dimension here in a constructive way? I don't have the answer, but I think those are some of the defining questions of the next several decades. Thank you.
If you want, I could address the question
Please.
about labor, but I'll add a complement to Daron's answer. There are two, Craig Calhoun, who's here with us today, has written a very good book on social movements in China. So that's part of the answer. You could look there to understand better the public sphere in China, but I have a colleague also, Ya-Wen Li, who wrote a brilliant book on the public sphere in China. So those are two things you may want to follow on. On Weber, I think, over much of the 20th century, it was always presumed that objective conditions, as traditionally defined in terms of, material resources, were the driver of social change. But there's been an explosion in the literature about identity-based social movements, entrepreneurs, moral entrepreneurs, that have completely transformed how we think about these things. So if anything, the relationship is far more complicated, and understanding political change really now requires considering both causal path at once. I personally am particularly interested in recognition gaps and how they are being bridged, in part because I think this is part of the cultural processes, social processes that have really not been studied as systematically as income inequality, for instance.
If we may, the question, of course, of dirty labor. What's the value of labor? If the value is defined by the wages, then of course, the simpler solution is to raise the wages, right? It's something like in Norway, obviously they've done it. So, but again, what the pandemic has shown us is that precisely the value of essential workers, and yet we don't want to monetize it. So on the one hand, we feel that yes, this has become essential work, and this is the way female labor was always in the family. It was an essential work, and yet was not monetized sufficiently, so therefore has no value. So there's a fundamental contradiction between the way those things are defined by the division of labor of the capitalist system, and then what will be our emotional division of labor, the things that we consider valuable. And so unless we put those things together, and it's a question of society to change the value of those things. So it's, those things do not need to be determined by the market, but on the other hand, we have to find ways of fighting it. So again, this may be too simplistic, but I think that ultimately this is the fundamental issue.
Thanks, Jose, and thanks, Michèle, for reminding Jose. I just wanted to add to Michèle's response on Weber a clarification. I think Michèle's entirely right. The question is framed in a way that puts status on the side of objective factors. And I think it's important to see that status is not entirely objective. If it's a hierarchy of honor and esteem and recognition, it's subjective. Being subjective doesn't mean that there are no constraints and that there are no material factors that influence this. And in fact, the more we buy into a dominant ethos of valuing economic standing, the more status gets combined with material factors. But nonetheless, it's partly subjective. I wanted to link this session to the discussion in the previous one, where there was a lot of discussion of meritocracy and privilege, and point out the prominence, which Michèle has stressed and her work has brought out very well, of issues of recognition and status alongside material differences, but also the immediate question of whether status issues are crucial to understanding certain things going on in American politics. For example, there are lots of accounts of the success of Donald Trump and of people voting for Donald Trump that stress the people who are not well off, who may have supported him, but then there are all the people who are pretty well off. And one of the questions comes to be, are there many people who may be making six-figure salaries who still feel a status injury in this allegedly meritocratic society where there's a value on certain kinds of educations and cultural attributes? Are there people who may have some money and some material success who don't feel that they are fully appreciated in that? Is that part of the explanation? And then lastly, I want to relate this to Rahsaan Maxwell's good comments, just by saying that part of the issue of cross-cutting versus coinciding cleavages or connections that he brings up is a relationship about value and status, not only about, if you will, material and socially structured cleavages. And so something to tease out for the future is that, and I think it's not likely to prove to be entirely psychological. The subjective should not be equated with psychological. You didn't do this, Rahsaan, but some other comments came close to that. It's a matter of what kinds of connections are forged. And these connections are in part chosen and created on the basis of values. The values aren't just reflections of where people stand at the beginning and of culture and orientation. So I'll stop, but I think the issue of status politics is a very central issue now, and the longing of many on the left to abandon status politics and identity politics and get back to real class politics is chimerical, because real class politics always involved an element of identity and status too. How did you know there was a working class? It was not just a material fact. It was a fact that was constructed. Do workers in different crafts belong to different caste-like or guild-like entities, or is there a working class that unites them? There was always this element of subjective construction.
I can also say thanks for that. I can say very quickly to the question about two-party and agility, because that's meat and potatoes political science. I mean, yes, the theory is that two-party systems are supposed to converge in the center because there are going to be two big parties and they're each going to compete for the widest number of people. And so therefore they're going to have very broad and moderate platforms. So all else equal, two-party systems will be less agile since they'll have very contradictory and broad and watered down platforms. Of course, there are lots of other things that come into play. One evidence of that, though, is the fact that you do see green parties all across Europe, but not in the US. You also see far-right parties all across Europe, but not really in the US. The one big counterexample there would be that if you have a very strong majoritarian system, if you get one party in control, then it can push through a lot of legislation, and you might see that in theory in the UK. But you're not going to see that in the US, because even, no one party can ram through a lot of stuff. They have very narrow windows. And so the US, as we perhaps all know, is all about being very unagile and stopping government from responding effectively to anything.
Well, I think that let's say thank you to the panelists. Thank you so much for your presentations and your thoughts. And thank you to everybody. I think we are finishing our session. And now we have the final conclusion. I think, Giancarlo, you want to take over, please.
Yes, thank you, José. I think I wanted only to say that we are very satisfied and happy of the work made by this panel, also the previous one, and also the work of yesterday. And we have a lot of stuff to work on. We have a work to carry on, and we got ideas we have to develop in some new meeting and conference and research about the issue of the social cohesion and democracy but I would like to leave the last word to close our day of work to Patrizio Fondi, who has been coordinating all this work and is there to say some final remarks about our conference. Please, Patrizio.
Thank you, Giancarlo. we come to the end of a very stimulating conference. And as scientific coordinator, I am really very satisfied and happy about the outcome. And I want to thank from my heart all the panelists for their engagement. We spoke during these 2 days of debate about division and inequality mostly. That was the core of our discussion. And it is clear from the debate that these issues are not only important for US, but for all the world. All over the world, we have this challenge. It's a growing challenge for the future, division and inequality. Even in Europe is becoming a crucial issue. Now, it was clear from the panelist approach that it's very difficult to heal this division. So it's very difficult to find the means to have some solution about this. And what was very interesting to me is that the reason why this is difficult is because compromise is becoming more and more problematic. And why this? Because belief of people are becoming sacred and existential. So this is also linked to the scary fact for me, coming out from your, let's say, analysis, that actually we are shifting from a, let's say, classical rational approach to which we are used to a kind of emotional individual truth. And of course, the risk of our society, if this is true, and this trend is not only temporary, that we go towards a kind of political and social bubble power. So to be honest, as a diplomat, I am very worried about this. It is clear that we need a lot of research. It's crucial to help institutions. I lived for all my career inside institutions, and I understand and I know how much is important the input for academy in order to influence the decision-making process. So really, I hope that this research you are doing is making the difference, because institutions should develop, and quickly, I think, we don't have much time, a new format for living together under a new social pact, and especially, as someone noticed in the last panel, developing a very important participatory approach. People should be involved in the decision, should have the feeling that throughout some platform, throughout some mechanism, they are part of their, let's say, destiny. I think that's very, very important. I felt this all over I worked in my career. As a diplomat, I cannot, of course, avoid to make a reference also to the debate on Atlantic relations. I think we heard some optimistic voices, some less optimistic, but let me say that we should work in order to make this relationship be very effective, because the only way we have is really to be in a strict partnership, close partnership between US and Europe in order to cope with these challenges. And I hope that the new administration could change the difficult situation we had with some decision taken by the past administration, especially about climate, of course, which is a crucial one for Europe, but also about digital, about trade, and about the pandemic. That are the 4 issues that President von der Leyen mentioned in these days for the new relationship with the United States. Lastly, I want to conclude thanking all the people who made this event possible. First of all, the organizer, in addition to Reset, I want to mention Centro Studi Americani and also the Italian Academy of the Columbia University. And last but not least, of course, I want to remember that the support of the Talbot Hillman Foundation was crucial, together with the additional support of the Carnegie Foundation and NOMIS. So thanks to all of you, and I hope to see you again in another occasion, maybe with some progress on the reflection on these very important issues. Thank you to all.